Okay, so what we will do now then is we will move to our final restoration woman writer, Margaret Cavendish, Duchess of Newcastle, who would much have approved that she's having two people speak about her, one after another. Um, and we will take questions and discussion related to those two papers. There'll then be another very brief break before we will move to a general discussion of everything that we've covered in the last 2 days. So over to you, Professor Sarasohn.
Welcome. This paper is somewhat different from the terrific papers we have already heard. I turn from the way texts and plays were read and performed and circulated in the 17th and 18th centuries to the question of how very recent scholars have analyzed the work of Margaret Cavendish, Duchess of Newcastle, particularly her writings on natural philosophy or science, as we would call it now. I was delighted to hear from Marie-Louise that Cavendish's books were widely owned in Renaissance libraries. Nothing would have made Cavendish happier herself than that. And I don't know if you can see her picture, but there she is. There she is. Margaret Cavendish, the Duchess of Newcastle, 1623 to 1673, was a prolific and imaginative thinker whose works are being rediscovered and analyzed currently. Until the mid-20th century, as David mentioned yesterday, her most well-known work was her biography of her husband, the Duke of Newcastle, who was a courtier and general, a very bad general, which was published in 1667. But starting in the 1650s, while in exile on the continent, Cavendish began publishing poetry and stories on scientific and ecological topics. After the Restoration, she produced what would become her most famous work, The Blazing World, in 1666. It's a romance about a kidnapped maiden who becomes the empress of a strange world inhabited by beast men and other fantastical creatures. It's part of that genre of going to the moon and other places. Blazing World also functions as a critique of the new experimental science, which Cavendish had attacked in her Observations upon Experimental Philosophy, which was published in the same volume as Blazing World in 1666 and then republished in 1668. In the 1660s, Cavendish also published revisions of her earlier writings that described her own natural philosophy or scientific ideas. And she composed a major work, the Philosophical Letters, responding to other thinkers, including René Descartes, Thomas Hobbes, and Henry Moore. She was not content to compose only philosophic works but also produced fictive collections of letters and volumes and orations on many different subjects, including gender, politics, and society. Several of these works have been published in modern forms, modern editions in the last 25 years, but there is little consensus about her major ideas. She was dismissed or ridiculed by most of her contemporaries. Mary Evelyn commented in 1667 after seeing Cavendish in London that her conversation was, quote, airy, empty, whimsical, and as rambling as her books, aiming at science, difficulties, high notions, terminating commonly in nonsense, oaths, and obscenity. Almost all recent interpreters of Cavendish's work disagrees with this judgment, and have tried to rescue her reputation as a writer and thinker, and some of her works are creeping into the canon taught in universities. But the many different elements in her works have led to vastly different interpretations of her contributions to scientific and philosophic thought. Some of these analyses tackle the question of whether gender informed the substance of Cavendish's natural philosophy, while other commentators almost completely ignore gender as a category of analysis at all. In this talk, I will examine these different approaches to Cavendish as modern scholars analyze the following elements of her thought: whether she was a feminist or not, whether she was a Republican or a monarchist, and whether she was a thinker whose works were consistent on human nature and material nature. Almost every recent monograph on Margaret Cavendish includes Virginia Woolf's judgment on the Duchess. Quote, "There is something noble and quixotic and high-spirited, as well as crack-brained and bird-witted about her." Woolf condemned Cavendish's philosophic work. What a vision of loneliness and riot the thought of Margaret Cavendish brings to mind, as if some giant cucumber had spread itself over all the roses and carnations in the garden and choked them to death, unquote. This kind of criticism continued into the second half of the 20th century, even by a biographer who sought to rescue Cavendish's reputation. Douglas Grant wrote in 1957, "Few other works of science fiction can equal the confused, ridiculous fancy of The Blazing World. As either narration or speculation, it is quite hopeless. The absurd action, the ludicrous situations, and the quasi-philosophical disquisitions make it unbearably dull. But as an illustration of Margaret's character, of her inordinate ambition, and of her retreat from fact into fiction, it is invaluable," unquote. Grant did assert that Cavendish deserved to be remembered, if for nothing else, as the most outspoken and influential feminist of her age. But he undercut his argument by arguing in what can only be recognized as sexist language. Quote, "Her ambition was inordinate and ludicrous, but it was also so naive as to be pathetic rather than offensive." By the later part of the 20th century, judgments like Woolf's and Grant's were increasingly challenged. Margaret Cavendish was poised to make the impact she had always hoped for, a resurrection in future ages. Gender was on everyone's mind in the 1980s and 1990s. Third wave feminism was breaking over the traditional the shoals of the traditional institutions, including the Academy. In an article I published in the Huntington Quarterly in 1984, now you know how old I am, I argued that, quote, "The natural philosophy of Margaret Cavendish was an attack on the authority of male-dominated science, and by implication, an attack on all male authoritarianism. In adopting the role of the female scientist, Cavendish implicitly turned the world upside down," unquote. The literary scholar Eve Keller wrote in the same vein in 1997 that there is a startling similarity between Cavendish's position and a post-Kantian and even a proto-feminist critique of the rational basis of mechanical science. But even during that period, there were scholars who questioned the feminist interpretation of Cavendish's works. In an article published in 1997, Deborah Boyle argued, there is very little evidence for attributing such proto-feminism to Cavendish. Contra other scholars who have argued there is a feminist way of knowing, Boyle believes that Cavendish did not have a particularly feminist epistemology, nor did she think that women would make better scientists than men. Indeed, by the time I published my work on Cavendish's natural philosophy in 2010, I softened my own stance, arguing that Cavendish's use of gender categories in both social and epistemological terms was more complex and nuanced than any simple feminist interpretation would allow. Cavendish believed that every creature in nature, and this is her natural philosophy, every creature in nature, from rocks to human beings, were composed of matter in motion, and matter itself was a continuum of what she called rational, sensitive, and inanimate matter. But whether this vitalistic materialism, as most call her theory, animates all her work, including her poetry and drama, remains a source of contention, as does the question of whether her thought changed over time or was relatively static. This debate also implicates how a student is supposed to read The Blazing World. Is it a feminist parable meant to demonstrate Margaret Cavendish's perception of nature is worthier than that of her male peers, or is it simply a satirical send-up of the scientific establishment? Most scholars argue that Margaret Cavendish's natural philosophy and her political and social theories were interrelated and testify to a coherence in her thought. In her recent monograph devoted to Cavendish's philosophy, Lisa Walter contends, while one might argue that Cavendish's science constitutes a mode of inquiry that is separate from and independent of her politics, Cavendish herself did not believe this, to which conviction her numerous assertions linking natural and political bodies attest. But Deborah Boyle states the opposite conclusion. Cavendish's belief that humans are unique in being motivated by a desire for public recognition undermines our abilities to draw parallels between her views of human society and her views of nature as a whole. We cannot make inferences about how Cavendish thinks about how human society operates or should operate based on what she says about nature. The very fact that Cavendish was so prolific, and I was happy to see that Marie-Louise says she was widely bought, if not read. The fact that she was so prolific explains how such two respected scholars publishing in Cambridge and Oxford University presses can come to such differing conclusions about Cavendish's ideas. But they do have something in common. They both believe that there's a key factor that can explain all of Cavendish's works. For Walters, it is Cavendish's belief in plurality and liberty. As an outsider, because of her intellectual isolation, her political exile during the interregnum and shyness, Walters insists that Cavendish was encouraged, quote, to challenge conventional ideas, to have sympathy for outsiders such as women, peasants, and animals, and to take a deep interest in examining different contradictory perceptions in her writings, since her own perceptions were often from the margin. Cavendish, unquote, Cavendish's receptivity to radical ideas, Walters concludes, resulted in a hidden republicanism in her work. Deborah Boyle, in contradistinction, argues that Cavendish's belief in the necessity of order explains both her natural philosophy and political philosophy, even if we cannot use analogy in one area to explain the other. Boyle contends Cavendish conceives of order and regularity as the highest goods in human society as well as in nature as a whole, and that reading Cavendish as valuing order and regularity is even more highly than freedom, allows a more accurate connection between her natural philosophy and her moral, social, and political philosophies. Society goes awry, according to Boyle, because out of self-love, humans also possess an irregular desire for glory, which undermines the basic harmony of the universe. Consequently, to preserve order at all costs, Boyle argues, Cavendish endorses political absolutism. So on the one hand, she was a Republican. On the other hand, she was an absolutist. Most scholars would agree with Boyle that Cavendish favored absolute sovereignty and was politically conservative, although few go as far as Boyle does in crediting Cavendish with a deeply pessimistic view of human nature and the state and a very negative view of female capacity. David Cunning, for example, in his introduction to Cavendish's Essential Writings, part of the Oxford New Histories of Philosophy series, writes, Cavendish was a very conservative individual on questions of social change, but her stories do allow us to entail structural conditions in which a society may aspire, and without the threat of being required to adopt them right away. A reader today might regard these as thought experiments and also visions for reform. Likewise, in her 2018 edition of Cavendish's early work, Poems and Fancies, however, Brandy Siegfried argues that Cavendish's early atomism is presented with playful delight and that, quote, Cavendish consistently proffered a celebration of life and a vindication of nature's generative virtuosity. She returns to the argument that Cavendish can be read as a proto-feminist. Siegfried concludes that, in short, when Cavendish asserted her own voice in print, she modeled and sounded a call for the creative endeavors of male and female voices in the making of reality-shaping literary and philosophic works. Siegfried argues that notions of homeostasis or equilibrium underlies Cavendish theories of gender, nature, and social organization. Like many political theorists before her, Cavendish adopted the idea of the body politic in The Animal Parliament, a parable that concludes Poems and Fancy. In the story, the soul calls a parliament together consisting of itself, the body, and the spirits. And the soul is the king, the nobility are the spirits, the commonality are the humors and appetites. Each contributes to the health of the animal kingdom by faithfully performing its function and using debate rather than war to resolve their differences. In other words, there is harmony when each order functions as it should. I agree with Siegfried's interpretation rather than Boyle's. In my book, I argue that unity and hierarchy are not antithetical in Cavendish's natural or political philosophy. She is neither an absolutist nor a Republican. Rather, her theory of nature and the state reflects traditional ideas about the functional and public responsibility of each order. Thus, we might contrast Boyle's idea of order, a natural and static condition of social and natural permanence, with the idea of orders, a free-flowing reciprocity between the different elements of human and physical nature. Boyle argues that Cavendish exempted man from this balance because humans possess a libertarian kind of freedom, which allows them to initiate actions independent of necessitating external forces. Taken to an extreme, human libertarian freedom allows men to pursue their own ends at the expense of what they should be doing or what social order demands. Hence, absolute rule is necessary. Siegfried and I also credit nature and human beings with essential freedom rooted in the capacity of rational matter to move independently. And now to Cavendish, she says, when the sensitive spirits do retire, or when the rational spirits persuade them to retire, then the rational spirits move after their own appetites or inventions, which are conceptions, imaginations, opinions, fantasies, or the like. I see I'm almost out of time. Cavendish knew from her own experience what happened when traditional order was corrupted, but she really believed that in her ideal society, the king of affection, Mrs. Cavendish, rules with clemency to rather than to be the only king of power, rules without tyranny and does not use slavery to bind her subject. And finally, to conclude, I should say that philosophers and students of philosophy have now discovered Margaret Cavendish, mostly because her observations were published in 2001 by Eileen O'Neill. She is now, according to Marcy Lascano, the it person in early modern philosophy. Boy, she would have really liked that if she had known about it. I'm going to conclude by saying the way Margaret Cavendish is read by modern scholars is in part because of the disciplines to which they belong. And this is a huge generalization because all readings of her are interdisciplinary. Nevertheless, I think that philosophers seek to see some kind of system at work in all of her works, while literary literary scholars investigate how she wrote and for whom she wrote and how her works were received, and historians like me want to know the context of her writing. Thanks very much. That's it.
Thank you very much, Lisa. That's a fascinating and wide-ranging way of starting our discussion of Cavendish. Without more ado, I'd like now to hand to Sean Moore for his perspective now on Margaret Cavendish.
Sean, unfortunately, we're not hearing you right now. Can you just make sure you selected the right microphone?
Sorry, there you go.
Thank you.
Should be able to hear. So this is the structure of this may seem a little odd, but I hope by the end it will make sense. I'm gonna start this off by talking about how we read Cavendish literally. So actual print editions or electronic editions. Between 1653 and her death in 73, Cavendish had 23 editions printed, 24 if you count the Latin translation of Life of William, printed in 1668, and then another printing of Life of William that was printed after her death in 1675, so 25 total. For all this work, encountering Cavendish in print today can be frankly shocking. Most of the modern editorial attention to Cavendish has focused on her literary texts. The Blazing World has appeared in standalone print editions by Kate Lilly, Sarah Mendelssohn, as well as a collection of Cavendish's works edited by Mendelssohn and Sylvia Bowerbank, Paper Bodies. David Cunning includes The Blazing World in his edition of the Essential Writings. That also includes selections of Cavendish's philosophical texts, and Susan James's edition of Margaret Cavendish's political writings reprints Lilly's Blazing World, along with what I think should be the only modern edition of Cavendish's orations of diverse sorts. A scholarly edition of Cavendish's Poems and Fancies by Brandy Siegfried was published recently that includes with it the Animal Parliament. A small edition of selected poems from the 1653 Poems and Fancies, edited by poet Michael Robbins, was published this past year. So I basically just outlined some of the print editions of her literary texts. She also had dramatic works published in Paper Bodies as well, and Anne Shaver's The Convent of Pleasure and other plays. Bennett's Bell and Campo and Sociable Companions. And there's also some self-published editions of the Female Academy and The Convent of Pleasure, both edited by Sharon L. Jensen. Beyond her specific literary works, Cavendish's expository prose has also been included in a few modern editions. James Fitzmaurice edited her complete Sociable Letters, and many of her orations have been included in Paper Bodies, but more fully in Susan James's collection. The only systematic treatise to receive an edition and not just a fragmented piece is Cavendish's Grounds of Natural Philosophy, which are edited by Anne Fell. Of all of Cavendish's scientific treatises, her observations upon experimental philosophy has received probably the most editorial attention, with Eileen O'Neill's complete edition and Eugene Marshall's abridged version. Marshall is also currently editing a modern treatment of Cavendish's philosophical letters, and a selection of those texts have been included in a small digital edition by Stuart Duncan. Besides these modern editions and the archive print material, scholars often rely on facsimiles of Cavendish's writing made available through the early English Books Online database. While EBO makes facsimiles of her texts available online, those facsimiles are difficult to read often and obscure any material or bibliographic elements. Access to the database is difficult for anyone not at a research university with a library budget big enough to pay ProQuest. The Renaissance Society of America has included EBO access with membership, making it a little bit more accessible, but outside of larger academic institutions, access to these facsimiles is incredibly limited. In 2014, EBO did partner with several library partners to attempt to correct this and provide more access. Thus, the EBO TCP Text Creation Partnership was formed to generate and provide reliable encoded texts through multiple stages over the first 4 years of the project. Phase 1 of this project encoded 14 Cavendish volumes that became publicly available in 2015. However, it was quickly discovered that the reliability of these texts was suspect. Many files, including the Cavendish's texts that were encoded, contained multiple errors, which is very common. Sometimes whole paragraphs were not transcribed at all. This is where the bigger issue kind of comes in. The 1668 version of Blazing World, if you compare it to the 1606 version of these electronic encodings, We'll show large selections of texts that are in the 68 edition, but not in the 1666 edition, making it look like a significantly different text. The reason for this seems to be the transcription and encoding. Numerous pages of text were just skipped for whatever reason. In other cases, multiple texts were encoded together, making a jumbled mess. In fact, some of William's writing gets mixed in with Margaret's in one of the facsimiles and encodings. As of this writing, the Phase 2 texts, which should have included plays never before printed in the world's olio, are still inaccessible. The Women's Writers Project has done excellent work, however, in producing a large selection of encoded texts that are available to paid subscribers. And Julia Flanders talked about the project yesterday. With the excellent works of the Women's Writer Project, it also means that scholars interested in using Cavendish's text to build a searchable linguistic corpus or to use the text or digital or machine learning projects have access to that work. But the last time I checked, there were still some texts that were not encoded. Digital Cavendish, which is an independent collaborative for the study of Margaret Cavendish, which is directed by myself and co-directed by Jacob Titalian and Liza Blake, began transcribing and hosting what we call reading editions of Cavendish's printed texts. These editions are direct transcriptions of text from archival holdings. Digital Cavendish has published one digital scholarly edition of Blazing World using Hypothesis, which is an online tool for digital annotations and collations. And Liza and I have just finished a modernized scholarly edition of The Convent of Pleasure. And through Liza's hard work, the goal is to eventually produce the complete works of Margaret Cavendish. Finally, there are also two digital editions of Cavendish's poetry, one from Leigh Tillman Partington's selection of atomic poems, and Liza Blake, once again, who's been working on an ongoing editorial project, which she calls Choose Your Own Poems and Fancies. And then Jen Boyle has a digital synthesis project on observations that has been released, and it includes a layered reading process for observations and Blazing World together, and it's really fascinating. So that's what we're actually reading with our eyes. And so now I'm going to move to sort of how we're reading Cavendish figuratively. While there is yet no promise of a BBC historical drama, inevitably to be titled Madge, right? The thrice illustrious and noble princess, Margaret Cavendish, has certainly made a mark on our scholarly and public imagination. Cavendish's fanciful and utopian world introduced the description of a new world called the Blazing World, is featured in the 2008 graphic novel The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, The Black Dossier, written by Alan Moore and Kevin O'Neill. Cavendish's world is painstakingly recreated, yet only visible in full detail with the use of 3D glasses, highlighting the complex geospatial layers and spirits that inhabit the ecosphere. Siri Husfit's 2014 novel Blazing World, the novel, resurrected the disembodied spirit of Cavendish, which haunts the fictional protagonist, Harriet Burden, an artist who is struggling to establish her creative authority and world making in the art world. Cavendish's spirit is summoned once again in Hermione Eyre's Viper Wine, a novel where Cavendish philosophical treatises provide a juxtaposition to the growing failures of Digby's alchemy. In 2015, there's an interactive graphic novel called Mad Madge, and don't get me started on Mad Madge. Talk about that moniker at length. A young roller derby athlete learns to believe in herself and dedicates her life to inspire others to embrace their uniqueness after reading Cavendish's writing, and mostly Blazing World. The graphic novel also features short articles on Cavendish's life and scientific theories to engage readers further. Cavendish's plays have been produced and staged for popular audiences, including a fabulous set of productions available on DVD from Gweno Williams. Cavendish's Unnatural Tragedy has recently been performed by several companies. James Fitzmaurice has even written and produced his own play featuring Margaret Cavendish as the main protagonist. Her philosophical influences have been featured in popular magazines like The Guardian and The Atlantic. And in 2017, she was sort of the feature on the What's Her Name podcast, which is a podcast dedicated to promoting women's history. Most recently, Daniel Dutton's Margaret I, a novel published in 2016, dramatizes Cavendish's early life and writing through an imaginative blend of autobiographical and literary fiction. Dutton has received critical acclaim for the novel's style and approach to a type of autobiographical literary fiction that dramatizes Cavendish's life and writing. The popularity of Dutton's novel is no doubt related to the recovery work of Cavendish scholars and feminist scholars and an invested interest in recovering women's intellectual history. It would seem Cavendish has caught the popular eye once again. With all its exposure, it would seem the Duchess of Newcastle has arrived, and that she has sort of grabbed this fame that she has sort of always wanted. The only thing missing, though, is Margaret Cavendish, oddly enough. Outside of Dutton's novel, Cavendish is glaringly absent from the eyes of modern readers. While her Blazing World exists as an alternate dimension in the Black Dossier, it's Shakespeare's Prospero who lives there. Husfit's novel tells the story of an artist who discovers some of Cavendish's work in a collection that also includes Cavendish's writing, Blazing World. Her presence in the novel, though, is that of more of an archival specter that haunts Burden's story. Ayer's anachronistic literary fiction novel uses brief excerpts from Cavendish's philosophical texts, kind of out of context. The interactive Mad Match does feature the Empress from Blazing World, but Cavendish herself only appears as sort of like a floating memory. Even when Cavendish is present, as in Dutton's novel, we see a Margaret Lucas Cavendish that is fascinating yet oddly unfamiliar to us. Perhaps when reading these texts and searching for her, Margaret Cavendish is unfamiliar to us because we've done that to her. It's our fault. In some ways, we're sort of unprepared, like our students who haven't done the reading. It's time to probably admit that what we're reading and who we're reading is fragmented, selective, and often repetitive. And that's because we've chosen to do that in the way that we've selected what we're giving readers of her text. And if we want readers to view Cavendish in the way that many scholars do, as a brilliant polymath who challenges the ways knowledge is produced through her writing, we need to edit and publish her work in that way as well. And in this, we are struggling. As it stands, our reading of Cavendish reflects a lack in bibliographic and editorial attention that erodes the great care she took to construct, correct, and enshrine her writing for future ages. And this sort of last section is, we're bad readers, but kind of even worse editors. Dutton's novel makes a great example here. Her author's note explicitly acknowledges the selections printed in paper bodies as a reference text for her novel. According to Bowerbank and Mendelssohn, the editors of paper bodies, their version of Blazing World is taken from the 1666 edition. Mendelssohn's new edition of Blazing World, published by Broadview in 2016, is an update of that edition in paper bodies. Susan James's Cambridge edition, which has Blazing World, is taken from Lilly's 1992 edition of Blazing World. Cunning's edition is the only one that seems to include a 1668 edition, although it's separated from observations with no indication really at all about the relationship, other than a few brief notes and in the introduction. Blazing World was first published in 1666 as an appendix to Cavendish's Observations and was printed again when the second editions of Observations was printed in 68. Two standalone editions of Blazing World were printed, again, one in 66 and one in 68. These are kind of very rare. They're very small print runs, but they coincided with the updated versions of Observations. Aside from changes in punctuation, spelling, and some linguistic clarifications to better differentiate between speakers, one could conclude, as many have, that there are no significant textual differences between these texts. There is, however, an important change in the prefaces. In 66 and 68 editions of Observations that include Blazing World, Cavendish has directed her work to the reader and has provided an overview of how this work is a bridge between it and Observations based on its philosophy. However, in both standalone editions of Blazing World, Cavendish directs a preference to all noble and worthy ladies and argues that her choice to print the work separately from Observations is, quote, "By reason most ladies take no delight in philosophical arguments. I separated some from the mentioned Observations and caused them to be by themselves." This time, the preface is not a copy of the Observations preface. Cavendish's preface makes the case that the creatoress wanted to provide a fantastical version of a work without the philosophical arguments, full well knowing that Blazing World incorporates the same philosophical arguments as her previous editions. For readers of the Cunning edition, though, they will encounter the second preface to the Noble Ladies with no indication of the preferences for the editions featuring in the OEP, the Observations, which outlines those more direct philosophical connections. Cunning's claim that this preference belongs only to this 6068 standalone edition indicates his reliance on the Ebo facsimiles, in which the 1666 standalone edition erroneously has the preface from the Observations editions. Thus, the readers of Cunning's essential writings of Cavendish's philosophy work will only know of the fictional Blazing World disassociated from the intricacies of Cavendish's ability to blend literary fiction and complex philosophical discourses through a standalone preface that is incredibly rare and not at all accurate representation of her larger work. And it may seem like I'm being a little harsh on Cunning's edition, but I think it exemplifies the larger problem in our editing of Cavendish's textual history. Of the 14 modern print editions, only half indicate a direct copy text. Lilly, for instance, notes the use of her use of the Harvard 1666 Blazing World. Only 4 of those 7 make explicit any other editions used as a reference for collation. This is a problem. Paper Bodies, arguably one of the most popular and accessible collections of Cavendish's work, simply does not indicate what texts were referenced to create the edition. Too many of these editions rely on a single text for transcription with no indication of collation. Those that indicate a copy text almost always use presentation copies, which are copies that have hand corrections or maybe even paper slips. These are preferred, with almost no attention paid to the non-presentation copies as reference, with the assumption, I think, being that since she wanted to take great care of these presentation copies, we should focus on them and not the other ones. But to produce an edition based on one text without knowing the production history, the print history of the text, and without collation of variants, how are we ever able to present Cavendish to readers? To make up for this lack of editorial work, almost all these editions have thorough introductions and contextualizations of Cavendish's life. The intro for the Jansen Convent of Pleasure, in fact, the introduction and contextualization is over 100 pages long, with the actual play being something around like 30 pages. While great attention is given to the social and historical impacts on Cavendish's growth as a writer, the same attention is not given to her textual print history. And what are we missing by not doing this homework? In a forthcoming article, Liza Blake uses a collation formula to analyze the printing of Cavendish's Blazing World, and excellently illuminates a fascinating issue regarding the printing of Part 1, Part 2, and the epilogue of Blazing World. And I'm not going to spoil for you this article because it's her article, it's her argument, and I think it's going to be groundbreaking. And I'm thankful to her for letting me read it since it hasn't been published yet. But it does tell us something big, is that we really haven't stopped to think about what Cavendish might have been doing as she's writing and then sending to print. Another text editors rely on for Cavendish is A True Relation of My Birth, which is included in Nature's Pictures. This text, more than any other, has been used to define Cavendish, especially in these long introductions, and even in our scholarship. But even this supposed autobiography reads quite differently when the bibliographic breakdown of Cavendish's text shows an internally curated image of Cavendish's thought processes. A revelation outlined by Rebecca Bullard in her wonderful bibliographic breakdown of Nature's Pictures drawn by Fancy's Pencil to Life, long title, 1656. With Bullard's work, I'd be hesitant to consider A True Relation as autobiographical. I certainly wouldn't rely on it as a historical record of Cavendish's feelings of the world around her. And now I'm in my final piece, which is sort of the aftermath of all of this. And I'm going to make a statement that is kind of harsh, but it comes from a loving place, as my mom used to say. Reading Cavendish in the 21st century is an unfortunate product of constantly undervaluing how invested Cavendish was in her own textuality. There simply has not been enough textual or bibliographical scholarship on Cavendish's texts, and it's no wonder when we continually allied Cavendish's writing and grammar as unlearned and at times unstructured compared to her contemporaries. We have failed to theorize Cavendish's editorial practices in full. And frankly, it's time to argue vehemently that Cavendish not only understood the development of her work and evolving ideas over time, that there's a method to every edition, whether it's just a reprint or not, but also that the corrections, the collaborative practices, the textual editing of her work are careful manipulations of her printed work that guides readers to understanding her writing as deliberate, dialogic, and discursive practices. Cavendish endowed her writing with sociable practices to instruct us how to read and interpret her work and the history around the creation of that work. This is social knowledge transmission, right, through print. We learn through reflexive thinking, through dialogues and interrogations, and it's not a linear process for Cavendish, and we see this quite often in her writing. These practices are really missing for modern readers. And some of my fellow panelists have already noted this in their scholarship of Cavendish and other early modern women writers who have been put in print recently. How we read Cavendish in all mediums is being defined really and structured by poor access and yet sort of scholarly fancy. Like if it's popular and we like it, we reproduce it. But we're entombing Cavendish in print because we select what we have access to, which isn't very much. And what we have access to is limited and really decidedly uncritical. And it's not all doom and gloom because I want to end it on sort of more positive note and where we can go from here with this. And thankfully, the work of James Fitzmaurice, Jeffrey Maston, Sophie Tomlinson, Rebecca Bullard, and Liza Blake have helped us expose the material and bibliographic gaps in Cavendish's textual history, at least some of them, and have illuminated important collaborative and editorial passages and works that can help us recenter our focus on Cavendish's living text, right? This is how she always thought of her text, that they would live beyond her. Without this excellent work, we would know next to nothing about the text's social constructs, deliberately constructed for readers by Cavendish. We need more of this work. And for anybody who wants to maybe think, what would be the next place to do this? The Life of William would be a good start. It's a text Cavendish cherished, yet it's a text that has had so little attention paid to it that even though there are over 104 volumes at 89 different libraries around the globe. Elaine O'Neill's edition also of Observations deserves praise, as it's one of the only editions that includes collation notes and extensive annotations. It's just a shame that Blazing Roll is not included. I'd also like to say that Julia Flenders brought up during her talk something that really kind of stuck with me is thinking of reading these works as schematics. And I think this accurately sort of captures something that Cavendish really thought about, which is in constructing her work, she is constructing for us the schematic of how to read and understand not just her process of thinking, but like her process of putting this into print and putting it out to the world. And so editions that take this into consideration are something that we really need to focus on. And an example might be, for those of you who are familiar with the Hester Poulter project, they do something like what they call amplified editions. And these ideas of sort of bringing these worlds together, but accurately looking at the history of the textual production in doing so, that's something that we haven't really done and we need to do more. I will say that, and this is sort of the end, and that I didn't even have a chance or time really to talk about how Cavendish is anthologized, which is its whole own issue. And I will say just briefly that in the anthologies, she's really just poems, and mostly the atoms. The world is an atom poem, maybe Rabbit in the Hare, and then maybe a selection of Blazing World. And that's really about it, right? So literary anthologies are really unfortunate when it comes especially to Margaret Cavendish. But I will say that one of the best editorial examples is an anthology and that is the Civil War Poets Anthology, which is a shining example, which includes copy texts, how they went about doing the collation, and plenty of annotations. And that is something, that's what we need more of. So, and that's it. That's sort of my ending, is that to sort of call to action to get us back on track.
Thank you so much, Sean. Margaret Cavendish was my first Restoration woman. She was the very first one I read, and it's great to be back and thinking about the detail of her text. Because our speakers have been so well behaved, we have about 15 minutes for discussion now of Margaret Cavendish. And there is already a question in Q&A, and so I'm going to start by raising that question. And it's from Jorge Rodriguez. And he says it's a question specifically designed for Lisa Sarasohn. He'd like to know, how do you think the different assessments of Cavendish's concept and use of fantasy, imagination relate to the different political views you've outlined?
Well, thank you for the question. I think that there is a direct correlation between her political views and her fanciful views. Most scholars have looked at Blazing World when they're talking about that, but there are other places to look in her writings to see how she feels about politics and fancy. And I think Sean mentioned Nature's Pictures, which is just full of interesting political commentary as well as fanciful ideas. People, particularly there's a story called The She Anchoret, where a maiden, of course, a maiden, decides she doesn't want to marry and she retreats into an anchorage, and people come and ask her views of different kinds of scientific, political, philosophical ideas. And I think if you read that work, rather than just Blazing World, or her plays as well, you come to the understanding that all of nature, all of the world is a continuum from material nature to social nature to political nature. And so, you know, it's all a comment on each other in her works. She's always commenting on herself. Blazing World, which is, as Sean has mentioned, the work that most people know about Cavendish, is really open to lots of scholarly controversy. I don't think I got to it in my paper, but the Empress at the end of the story is advised by the character, the Duchess of Newcastle, who's appeared in the story as part of the story. And the Duchess says, well, you know, you've been acting very arbitrarily and in an absolute manner. It hasn't worked out very well. So why don't you change what you've been doing? And the Empress goes, oh no, I can't do that. And Cavendish, the character, says, oh yes, you better do it. And I think this is a comment, a fictional comment, that political authority should be malleable and should be open to suggestions and to change. I don't know if that answers the question, but you know, once again, there's so much in her work. She published so much, as Sean has mentioned, that can come up with so many different interpretations.
Thank you. We have quite a lot of people coming in now with Q&A. And so I'm going to move straight on to a question from Lisa Blake. Thank you for being here, Lisa, which is addressed to both of you. And she thanks Sean for his invigorating call to action and asks us to connect with Sean's claim that how we read Margaret Cavendish is directly related to which editions we have available, to what Lisa was talking about in terms of how different disciplines read Cavendish. So her question to you is, to both of you, is whether either of you has thoughts about what it means to think editing differently from the perspectives of different disciplines. Are you willing to start with that one, Sean? Different disciplines editing differently?
I guess I can start with that one. You know, so because Lisa brought this up that Cavendish has really sort of had a sort of new life in terms of philosophy because of the editions like Elaine O'Neill and David Cunning's edition. And these have really like invigorated a whole new disciplinary focus on Cavendish as a philosopher of a specific area. But a lot of those editions are really focused on trying to like extrapolate ideas that are related to other realms of philosophy, right? So where is Cavendish's work in correlation or connection or in the world of other philosophical thinkers? And so those editions have kind of really focused on that quite a bit. And then, you know, I think that there is this sort of other realm of sort of documentary editing, which is just, you know, trying to get a document transcription as clear as possible from the printed text to the reader. And those ones maybe aren't as successful because they're just not, and Lisa's brought this up, they're not contextualized, right? And that context is really important. And so they try to like contextualize them outside of the editions, like in these little prefatory materials, kind of like Cavendish, but it's just not, it doesn't seem to be as impactful for readers. And so, you know, that's kind of, and then sort of the literary side, which you have the dramas. The dramas are kind of funny because they're so popular, but like out of the 20 dramas that she wrote, we maybe only have 6 of them in print, in modern print or electronic editions. So they're really, really underrepresented, I think, because literary scholars have really not, they've really struggled to take up the work of editing.
Anything you'd like to add or suggest, Lisa, on this question?
Well, you know, I've spent a good deal of time in the last couple of months reading the philosophers who are commenting on Cavendish. And as Sean just mentioned, they are looking for things in her work that literary scholars and historians have not really examined. And, you know, it's kind of funny, you know, all of us who called her a proto-feminist, they've decided she's a proto-Kantian or a proto-Leibnizian or a proto-Humean, and they're analyzing, and even some of them a proto-French theorist, modern theorist. And so they are really looking at her work in a way that I never have, and maybe it's certainly worth doing, but I do think it distorts her work. A lot of them are concentrating on her epistemology and how it functioned, and, you know, far be it for me to understand much of this stuff, but it just doesn't work. It doesn't work, I think, with my apologies to David Cunning and Deborah Boyle, who certainly are brilliant scholars, but, you know, it doesn't work. And by the way, I should say to Sean, what you have to say is very, somewhat takes me aback. If I've been depending on editions that are not dependable, I don't know where to go from there.
I mean, I do think that that's, you know, you mentioned the David Cunning and Boyle, that sort of, I do agree with you that there's really fragmented version of Cavendish. And I think part of that, and I hate to say this because it seems so mean, but it's because they're not really doing the work of editing. They're not really doing editorial work. I mean, a lot of what's happening, and when I started going through this, and I have all of the modern, I bought them all, right? So I like have them, I'm looking through them. Just the number of them who don't even bother to talk about what text they look at in library holdings, what references they made. You know, it's just like, and these are getting printed as scholarly or critical editions, and that seriously concerns me for our field, or for us. I'd like to call us Cavendishians. I'm really kind of worried for us. And Elaine, if you don't mind, because Laura Dodds has a question that I think leads right into this.
Yes, that was exactly where I was going as you were talking. So we're going out of sequence now with Q&A, but indeed, Laura Dodds is wondering about what you might have to say about the reasons for the situations, the reasons for the state of play with Cavendish's text. And Laura goes on to comment, from some perspectives, Cavendish is one of the most canonical of early modern women writers, with a very rich tradition of scholarship within literary studies, especially. On the other, as Sean's pointed out, the representation of the writing itself is so fragmentary. Is it the sheer volume of her publications? Is it interdisciplinarity, her own brilliant and sometimes misleading self-representations? Or is it something else altogether? What's going on? Why are the texts so poor?
Yeah, I've thought a lot about this, and I think part of it is lack of training. We don't really train textual bibliographers anymore. There are very few classes in bibliographic editing, right? But also part of it, I do think, is that we want the sort of what we like see as these like odd versions of Cavendish, or these unique versions of Cavendish, where she's kind of flipping her ideas or critiquing herself, but then promoting another idea. That we're so fascinated with those, and we're so fascinated with like her herself in history as a writer in the interregnum, that we like want to focus on that and not really focus on what she's doing with the texts themselves. You know, and I hate to you know, because Lisa brought this up, like the amount of times that like we reference Virginia Woolf in terms of Cavendish instead of referencing like Cavendish and her printers is part of that problem, right? Where we sometimes focus too much on this like the way that other people have felt about Cavendish, and not the way that she feels about her writing herself. And I think Lisa brought this out, right? Is that the more that we do actually think about that, the better our scholarship gets and the better our editions will get. But there is also the volume of writing. And I think there's a disciplinary argument to be made, because some people, you know, the way I read those printed editions, the 24, 25 after her death, some people will only want to call those 13 because they don't want to include, say, 3 different printed editions of World's Olio. They only want to call them 1 edition, because no work has been done to really look at those differences. You know, and so like we have an issue there when we talk about like what exactly her body of work looks like. I will quickly end this and just say that when I approached Cambridge with like, hey, how about the complete works of Margaret Cavendish? They laughed. They just were like, absolutely not. And they're like, maybe you should do that on your digital Cavendish project. And I was like, okay, I guess I will.
As part of your explanation there, Sean, you were talking about people wanting to find a particular kind of Margaret Cavendish and focusing on that rather than on the writing. And it happens that there's a question in Q&A from Margaret Reeves, which she's directed specifically to Lisa, that's very much along those sorts of lines. I wonder whether we might go there. Margaret Reeves says, to what extent are the ways that Cavendish is read still influenced by the tendency to read her into her works? That's to say, a tendency to read her works as if they're an expression of wish fulfillment or evidence of her psychological state of mind?
Boy, that's a tough question. But yeah, I guess, I was thinking about, oh gosh, was it you? It was you, Elaine. Somebody was talking about how we want to think of women as retiring and bashful and all of those kind of psychological issues. And, or, Aphra Behn, it was the wonderful talk about Aphra Behn, about whether she was broke and penniless at the end of her life and in bad health or not. We do, I think, want to read the person into the work, and it's very hard not to. I've certainly done it in my work on Cavendish, but when she appears as a character in her own fiction, what are we supposed to do about that? She's constructing herself, obviously, in a certain way. Whether that's the real her or not, I don't know. Maybe Sean can discover the real Margaret Cavendish. I don't think I can, and I don't think the modern fictional works about her do. It's funny. It's so many people have asked me whether I was going to write a novel about Margaret Cavendish. And, I always say, I don't write fiction, and I don't. She wrote fiction. I don't know, Margaret Reeves, what do you think? An answer question.
We have another important question from a quite different angle in Q&A that I wonder whether you'd both be willing to address, and perhaps this time again, Sean, you get to start, which is a question from Sandra Goldstein-Leonard asking, in what ways one might read Cavendish in the context of English colonization and enslavement? Are there examples of that vein of reading of her work?
Yeah, this is a great question, because, and this is one of the areas where I think we really haven't done much work at all, which is, during her time in exile and just in her movements and how that reflects in her writing and printing process. She waits, right, to print some material until she can get back to England. Some of it is printed when she's in Antwerp, right? The sort of geographical issues are there. And Antwerp is a particularly interesting place because she meets so many people and so many things happen, and there are threads of colonialism. And in Blazing World itself, right? There's quite a bit in the text, and this is why I think Liza's forthcoming article will be so interesting, because there is this tension between Blazing World Part 1, Part 2, and the epilogue, where Part 2 is this kind of oddly overtly political relationship between worlds, where the Empress and the scribe Margaret Cavendish, who is not quite Margaret Cavendish, but is Margaret Cavendish, is floating there, where they're sort of committing this sort of political control and authority, or asserting it, is very interesting. And I think that we haven't really really looked at that as much as we should. And this goes back to Lisa's question earlier about, who was with her when she's at the Royal Society, because, and Liza Blake pointed this out, Pepys refers to Cavendish sometimes as Black, but he uses that so irregularly to sometimes mean just the darkness of her hair, maybe complexion. And Farrah Bosco was with her as a maid in waiting, who's also sometimes described as being Black, and whether that means hair or skin color. And Tina Malcolmson, I think, and Tina Malcolmson, who passed away this past year, Cavendishians have lost quite a bit. We lost Tina Malcolmson and Brandy, and which has really been a devastation for a lot of us who study Cavendish. But Tina is really one of the only people to write sort of a larger body of work on Cavendish and race, and especially the Royal Society in her book. And I think it's one of the things that we really should take time to focus on, because we haven't really at all.
Yeah, if I can add to that, I haven't really thought about race a lot, but it should be noted that when she arrives in the Blazing World, her character arrives in the Blazing World, the Empress character, all of the inhabitants are hermaphroditical in some ways. They combine bestial and men and male figures. They're licemen and fleamen and all sorts of different kind of strange creatures. And then the subjects of the Empress have all different kinds of complexions. And complexion is a loaded kind of attribute at this time. They are many colored, in other words, many different colors. The Empress then essentially takes over the Blazing World and to some extent enslaves it, making the different characters do different things. And when the Duchess arrives, the Duchess character arrives, she instructs the Empress to dissolve the societies of the different creatures she's made. Is this a comment on whether colonization should be dissolved? What should we do with hermaphroditical figures? I haven't really thought a lot about it, but I do think it does go into these discussions of race as well as gender in all of this. And, in the second part, she makes these creatures into her soldiers in conquering other worlds. So, how does that manifest? It's a wonderful question. I have to think a lot more about it than I have.
And I'll add too that the hermaphroditical nature is interesting in hybridity in general, because Cavendish seems to take a very biological view of hybridity, and especially like plant hybridity. And so we haven't really also then contextualized the sort of colonial aspects of that science.
Yeah.
And that understanding of what the merging of two things looks like and how that gets interpreted by the Royal Society into then how Cavendish is then using that in her own work, and how that might be carrying on these sort of, colonial traces in her own work. It is really an area that I think, if you're interested, we need to be doing this work, because it's really it's been left alone.
We have 1 minute left till we're meant to have our break, and there is a question of fact, which I don't know whether either of you has an answer, from Tracy Winkler, who's asking whether there are printings before 1800 in other languages of any of Cavendish's works.
The life was translated into Latin. Yeah. Sean, do you know any more?
Other than that, other than the Latin translation, I can't think of any other that are translated into any other languages. I mean, that's one of the things now I didn't talk in my paper, is that we do have multiple translations now, like Blazing World in Spanish, but we, before 1800s, no, other than the Life of William that she.
Yeah, and can I have just one more comment about Cavendish, that to some extent there's so much interest because she's being added to the canon of people, of white dead males. Now we have a white dead female. And, if we don't have correct editions of her work, what are students going to do? How are they going to interpret all of this, for what it's worth?
Indeed, and I've now got my chair hat back on. I can't see, don't know if you can see it, but it's definitely there. We have 15 minutes and then we're going to return and we're going to talk about everything that we've talked about across these 2 days. So thank you very much. Do you want to open this section, Steve, or do you want us to proceed?
No, please proceed.
Okay, so we have several questions outstanding in Q&A that are at a level of general significance that I think they fit very well in this part of the conference. So firstly, there's a question from Georgiana Ziegler, which is addressing specifically to Julia. And this arose during the time that we were talking about questions of race earlier this morning. And what Georgiana wanted to ask Julia is what kinds of modeling or systems there may be for identifying discussions of questions of race in restoration writings or in the Women's Writing Project text more generally.
This is a wonderful and hugely timely question, and I appreciate it very much because the Women Writers Project has just embarked on a new research initiative for which we've got a little bit of internal funding, and we're now seeking larger external funding to really dive into exactly this question. And the first step has been to bring together a group of scholars who are serving as collaborators and advisors on this to help us think about what it means to represent race through a system of markup, or in, you know, how would a theory of representation of race need to adapt systems of markup so that it is not, so that what we're doing is not creating a kind of brittle or appropriative version of just sort of marking a simplistic or caricature version of that set of ideas. So we've begun with that, and we're proceeding on several different fronts. One of which is to add more texts by women of color and more texts that thematize race to the Women Writers Project collection so that we have a body of material to work with. The second is to start the conversation about what we mean by representing race, and I think we're unpacking that question to mean not only representing depictions of racialized bodies, but also to think about how race is woven into the discursive structure of texts from across this entire period, so that it's present even in places where it isn't being explicitly exposed. And then the third question is, now getting to Georgiana's specific question, how one would then mark whatever those phenomena are that we agree are salient and useful to scholars who are working in this area. I suspect that we're going to end up with a lot of different approaches, and some of them are going to involve things like marking spaces where racial descriptors are used in the texts. Racialized descriptors are used to describe specific people, specific bodies. And an accompanying area would be to identify the race, the imputed race, or the sort of the flexible identifiers of racial marking, whether of Black or brown or white bodies, in the texts, and associating those also with a full inventory of people who are named or mentioned in text. So at the moment, we have the author, people who appear on the title page get kind of a space in our personography, and people in dramatic texts get inventoried in the cast list. What we would do as a further step is create a similar kind of an inventory of all the people, all the humans who are represented in these texts, and then associate racial descriptors from the text with that inventory, and also some formalism, which I think we need to really think hard about, so as to make race visible as a kind of pervasive representational system within the texts. I think they're also going to turn out to be other really important ways of representing race, which we can't do at large scale yet, because they involve such sort of deeper interpretive work or careful, precise marking of the text. And those might involve things like, the almost like structural elements of how situations are framed. For example, dialogues between people of different races, or some of the kinds of things that Joyce was talking about in her wonderful paper about sort of the interior dynamics of situations or of genres, or intertextual relationships, that kind of thing. I'm waving my hands in the air because I think this is a huge question that lies ahead. And we're excited to be working with a whole bunch of really smart people who make it their business to really think hard about this. So I think my answer is sort of a watch this space, and we have some ideas, but we're moving slowly and with moving slowly and attentively.
Thank you, Julia. That was fascinating, and I think very good news for all of us. Even those who weren't already actively using the Women Writers Project, I think will be, on the basis of what you were showing us yesterday about what is possible to do with it and through it. So thank you. Second question, matter that's come up that I wanted to come back to in this sort of discussions that have gone on between the panelists around the edges of the conference, connects to the circulation of texts, because of course we are thinking about reading and how things get to be read. This is really for anybody, but especially those who are working with manuscripts as well as print materials to talk about, please, which is whether your research suggests that there were overarching general ideas, principles, assumptions about what you did when you sent a text, a gift to someone, or when you sent a manuscript of something to them, or whether these are things that are really quite specific and personal to the individuals that are having materials sent to them or who are sending the materials. And I'd be glad really for thoughts on that from any of the panelists, this gifting or circulating of one's print or one's manuscript material.
Well, I'm sure, as everybody knows, giving a gift creates a tie between the two people, a patronage tie. And there's been a lot of work done on patronage in the last 20 years. So circulation also has a social attribute to it. I would just add that to it.
I might just add that sometimes people are lending things so that their friend can make a copy and then give it back. It's a permanent gift, but just, I'm too busy to make a copy of my poems, but you can certainly make one for yourself, and here's something you can work with.
In terms of playwrights, it's also about soliciting an audience. Mary Picks apparently gave a copy of Ibrahim to her friend Richard Minshall before the play was performed. So putting it in his hands as a text to be read, puts it in the hands of the person that she knew who was most socially influential. Mm-hmm. And if he talks it up in one way and it, as it did, it wins an audience in the theater another way, then these are, sort of supplementary ways of trying to get her work out there. And it implies a really different kind of relation that intimate social contact on the one hand, and then, throwing it out on a giant stage in front of 2,000 people on the other hand. But both of them together seem like they're necessary for her to try and get her career as a successful playwright started.
I might mention that, excuse me, there's a complete copy of Katherine Philips' second edition, handwritten in the Folger Library, and it's clearly an unprofessional piece of work. It contains all kinds of teeny tiny mistakes, and the handwriting isn't terribly stable. And I was looking at it one day in the Folger, and Catherine Loomis came over and suggested that it might be like making jam and giving it to your friend. So it's better to have homemade jam than to buy it in the store, and better to have a handwritten copy as an act of love, if you will, or a friendship, than to even pay somebody to do it.
Yeah, all kinds of social dimensions about this private circulation that overlap with and sometimes contradict more public kinds of circulation.
Right.
I would add, I know this is a familiar phenomenon, but just because it's so different from some of these examples that we can think of as either gifts or generating an audience or patronage, and that is the expectation of reciprocity that we all know happens, but it is such a very different dynamic, isn't it? In some ways, one can be said to receive an assignment, right? Instead of a gift on receiving a poem, because, now I need to respond. Which of course was done with great pleasure, but it is just to add to this mix of so many different models that come up. One that we also see, of course, in the poetry as part of the really deep conversational structure of so much poetry.
Could I add also that there's the phenomenon of manuscript circulation that has nothing to do with the author. So beyond kind of gift giving or authorial intentionality, which in some cases causes anxiety, as for Katherine Philips, but for other authors, they're not even aware of it, especially as you get into the 17th century, these texts, especially poems, are just going into a wider circulation, but being rewritten in the way that Betty was talking about, the kind of the value of that, the personal experience of writing it, and that you're imbibing it in some way by copying out by hand. People do adapt the names in poems to their own coterie, coterie is probably the wrong term to use, but their own community and their own reading community, and change them and adapt them. So there's that phenomenon of manuscript circulation as well.
David has a terrific article on that in English Manuscript Studies, in which he talks about, is it Robert or Richard Overton?
Robert Overton, yes.
Yeah. Well, why don't you say what he does?
Well, he takes some poems by Katherine Philips and Quarles and Wither and other poets and rewrites them as memorials to his wife. And he says at the beginning, I can't do it myself, so I'm just going to borrow other poets who can do it for me. But he rewrites the poems so they will fit her. And
sticks 2 or 3 together sometimes even.
Yeah. So there's a little bit of creative intervention at the same time, and that's the kind of thing you can do in a manuscript.
It's really poignant. It points to the intimacy on the one hand, and yet the seeking of a large public audience on the other, that both of these registers exist, built up around the same text.
In fact, David, I've forgotten, although I reread your article a couple of days ago, she is dead, so it's not who does he give the manuscript to? Is it really just for himself?
I think it seems to be just for himself, his immediate family, a bit like Lucy Hutchinson, immediately writing just for her own children, and a way of coping with his feelings, really, I think, working them through.
There's a lot more to be done here, isn't there, about these sorts of questions. That's an excuse for another conference, Steve. Another question which I know is hovering, and because David's just been on the screen, I wondered whether we might take that, because it works quite nicely with David having opened the conference and Cavendish speakers ending it. And David, you said there was a question that you wanted to put to the Cavendish
sort of kind
people?
of comment and reflection is partly coming from a that juxtaposition of those two wonderful papers from Lisa and Sean, which seem to push in kind of opposite directions, because Lisa was showing astonishing opening up of Cavendish studies. I mean, international interest, interdisciplinary interest, masses and masses of different editions. That's a huge transformation since that 1984 article. And that's surely something to be very pleased about. And Sean, on the other hand, is showing how there's been a real sort of falling short in basic editorial practices. And I'm afraid I think that I'd agree with that. I think that's, I've found myself feeling that myself. And one part of me wonders is sort of kind of inverse relationship really between getting the public involved and doing a really thorough scholarly edition. I speak as someone who's signed on in 1999 for an edition of Lucy Hutchinson's collected works. We now got volume 2 out in 2018. So far, I think we received 2 editions and sold possibly 80 copies. So it's not kind of setting the world on fire in any way. And it's a huge amount of work, as I'm sure I see often Betty and Elaine sitting at different desks in the folder, just going through the very tedious work of checking and rechecking. So it's not maybe attractive work for a young scholar going in unless there is some funding available. I don't know what funding available currently there is, for example, in the United States, but you do need collaborative work to do that edition. But I also do think that there's a sort of ethical factor to it. I think if you want to tell us what the writer wrote, you get what the writer wrote, and if you believe in delivering what the writer had to say, you deliver exactly what she said. But it's difficult to do and costly. I hope maybe if Cambridge weren't interested, then perhaps Oxford maybe. They are doing a lot of big editions. And the other thing is I've always felt a kind of pleasure in the fact that the OUP is a kind of ultimate kind of respectable, on the whole, rather male and patriarchal Oxford English texts publisher, and having a woman writer in that just as a way of saying, well, look, that's changing a little bit the parameters. And I can't help wondering whether there may be a sense in which, I don't know if either Lila or Sean, the feeling that in some ways, because of a lack of such an edition, it may be that somewhere there's a niggling feeling this writer isn't quite serious, and maybe that Cavendish has struggled to overcome that reputation of being dotty and crazy and mad and so on. And she is clearly being taken much more seriously by political philosophers and scientists and all these people. So that's changed. But I think probably a kind of a big solid edition might also help.
Well, can I respond to that? Brandy Siegfried's very recent edition of Poems and Fancies is, I think, extremely well done, well edited. It's also very thick, and I don't know how accessible it is, consequently, to both scholars and students. So, it's a real problem. It does, creating a correct edition versus accessibility. And it becomes a very, very massive problem. And I wish that Sean and his compatriots will be able to sell a complete works to somebody. But whether that will be accessible or not, I tend to doubt it.
Yeah, I mean, I think Liza's done good work, and we seem to have gotten a sort of informal confirmation from Punctum Publishing that they would be interested in digital editions with print on demand editions from them, which I think solves some of the money issues, so that way they don't have to run a full print first.
Right.
And I think that's how we'll get finally the complete works of Margaret Cavendish. But I think, David, you bring up a good point in the sort of the reputation. I do think that does play a lot into it. And I brought this up about the Mad Madge. Like, if you get me started on this, Katie Whitaker has probably the best biography of Cavendish. And yet at the very end is like, hey, nobody actually ever called her this during her time. And in fact, this seems to be a late addition by a very particular person who was reading Pepys and others in a very specific way, and it's given Margaret this moniker, and then titles the biography Mad Madge, which like, why? And I think a lot of people for years have been fighting against this particular view, and she does have kind of an interesting afterlife of reception. Like Sir Walter Scott does not seem to have been a fan. And seems to have sent a number of her, he must have gotten or purchased a number of her collections and sent them off. It was a lot of the plays he sends to friends and says, hey, you wanted to read this wild set of plays, here they are. Don't blame me for
maybe that is part of the problem is the sale. I mean, I wonder if that was a publisher's decision. And also, I have to say, if it was Mad Lucy, I can't suspect I might sell a few more copies. So.
Yeah, it might have been a publisher's decision. That's true. Like, this is a nice, catchy title, right?
Well, the other thing, it's subtitled, the Mad Madge book is subtitled The First Woman to Make Her Living by the Pen.
Right.
Aphra Behn scholars, I think, would probably object to that. But it certainly sets up a misconception of who she was.
We have, as this discussion has rolled very interestingly, we've had a question come up in Q&A, which I think it may be that everybody would have something to say about. It's a question from Margaret Azell, and Margaret starts by talking about, in a general sense, the changing popularity of women writers in the classroom, and talks about having taught Cavendish and Roth in the late 1980s, early 90s, probably using printouts from Women Writers, the Women Writers Project, indeed. And in Margaret's experience, she says, students were at that point, in the late 80s, early 90s, very resistant. But her experience more recently, in the last 10 years, is that both undergraduate and graduate students adore Cavendish, and will read her and are disinclined to read others, that the students that Margaret's teaching seem to find Cavendish very contemporary, and they tie her to social media. Margaret's asking a specific question about Cavendish. I would really be quite interested to open this up, though, more generally, to the speaker's experience of teaching Restoration women writers to a contemporary audience, or to an audience of 40 years ago, as I was, or whatever. And I'm actually going to not let the Cavendish people speak first, because they've just been doing the speaking. Anybody else have any thoughts, any comments about the experience?
I've had great success with the Rover, which I think is a really easy play to teach. And especially my female students have responded it because, Angelica is this sort of professional bad girl, that they really like the fact that this person who is immoral and a prostitute who's just basically running her own life is in charge. So that has been really appealing. At the other end, and although it's not a Restoration play, students have also responded really positively to the tragedy of Mariam, the fair queen of Jewry. I know this is obviously not a Restoration play, but they're not the same students either. But what they like about this play is that this is a character who seems to assert herself and to have this really clear view of who she is and, you know, what she's willing to die for. I as a teacher, I kind of don't get that, but a lot of times you just have to go where your students lead you. But it's been a while since I taught it, but the rover of these plays, I think, is like the easiest.
Yeah. Well, I trust, though, Joyce, that you're going to decide that the edition that I've just finished editing is going to be superior to all the other editions.
I'm sure that's the way it will turn out.
Thank you. It is a brilliant play, I agree. Any other thoughts on the way that our students connect to or reject Restoration women writers?
Well, I've just been teaching Orinoco or Orinoco, and you know, with all of the debates around race at the moment, it's gone right. It's electrified them. You know, they've really enjoyed it, and it really resonates with them right now, which is why I put it back on the course. In terms of the layers of representation and the complexity of having that female narrator who's complicit yet distant, and she herself is so complex with it. So that's gone down really well. But the other thing I would say is actually someone else's experience. Micheline White is about to publish an article on her experience of teaching a great books course and the shift that's happened in putting women in. And what she says in the article is that kind of 10 years ago, she had to do so much extra work in the classroom in explaining who the women were and giving all the background and the context. And it was so hard to get additions. And what she particularly, one of the things she says now is that's all gone, and she attributes a lot of it to her university's employment of a learning management system. So the students' reception of all the texts is the same. It's all electronic, and it flattens out those differences of editions that we've been talking about. So she says, if anything, her problem now is that the students treat the women writers exactly the same. So if anything now, she has to inject them different, and she has to explain to them why it is that the women writers were up against it or had a different set of circumstances. But it's a really interesting article. It'll be coming out really soon, but it's that shift, I think, is partly about our own technological shifts as well as ideological or political shifts.
Yeah, I think it's about our students' political shifts as well. They're in a different position now than they were.
Absolutely.
Started doing this.
Right. Well, I think, although I'm sure others have got something to say as well, and I'm sorry to be so rude about this, but it happens that Steve Hindle mentioned to me during the break that there was something that he wanted to raise, and I think we really should invite the research director of the Huntington to raise his question.
Thanks very much, Elaine, and I absolutely do not want to have the last word here. But just as a response to the conversation that's been going on, particularly in light of Elaine and Claire's papers about income and standard of living, and what constituted a reasonable standard of living in the late 17th century. An agricultural labourer, if he was lucky enough to work the maximum number of days available, might earn between £8 and £9 a year in the 1680s. So an income of £20 a year for a lighthouse keeper is really pretty generous, I would have thought. But a more general way of thinking about this is the distinction that's made in Alex Shepard's really rather wonderful book, Accounting for One's Self, about the relationship between a stock of assets and the flow of assets. That's a very interesting book in all kinds of ways. It's about self-perceptions of wealth in 17th century England. It's published by OUP about 2 years ago, but it would be well worth a look, I think. Thanks for the opportunity.
That's brilliant. Right. Well, since Steve has said he doesn't want to have the last word, could I please encourage any of our panelists who hasn't said much in this last couple of hours to comment on something? It's a big responsibility.
It's kind of in response to Margaret Azal's question. And it really is just a comment. But I should add that I graduated my BA in 2005, and when I did so, I commented that I'd read more women writers on my courses than Milton or Dryden and so on. So that was my experience.
I think that's a splendid note to end on, in fact.
I have kind of remedied it a bit since.
Mhm.
And I would like to thank the Huntington for giving us this extraordinary opportunity. And I know that the panelists are now going to continue to more conversation and I hope publication together. Even more than that, I would so like for us all one day to be at the real Huntington.
Yes, well, me too. Catherine Murray Miller has just taken some absolutely breathtaking photographs of the Rose Garden, which I don't know whether you want to see them or not. It might make you feel worse. I don't know, but I'm happy to distribute them. But I would like to say on behalf of the Huntington and on behalf of everybody in the audience, how delighted I am with the conference, how interesting and stimulating I found the papers. I think it was exceptionally well put together program. And for that, Elaine, we are all deeply in your debt. So on behalf of all of us, thank you for everything that you've done. I often say that the success of a Huntington conference is putting the right people in the room. Well, what you've done is put the right people on the Hollywood squares. So thank you.